Great, and we'll just maybe give it a minute or two, and then we will get started.
Listen, if you want, I can take over the admin duty and letting people in through the lobby. Would you like me to do that?
I think we have Fergal on
Oh,
that, but
okay. Okay.
certainly it's
Okay.
it's also helpful to have
Okay.
a second set of eyes there. Thanks for Luca. Well, maybe we can get started. So thank you everyone for joining us here today for the flash event on inclusive governance in Syria, identifying challenges and opportunities. So my name is Alison McCullough. I am a professor of political science at Brandon University in Canada, and one of the principal investigators on the Inclusive Peace, Citizen Inclusion and Power Sharing Settlements project, under whose auspices, along with the Form of Federation, we're here today. So I'll be moderating today's event, and I'll just walk us through what to expect over the next 90 minutes or so. And the first thing I will note is that this event is being recorded. So, what brought us here today? I think it is with a mix of hope and trepidation that we come together to think and learn with our panel of experts on the prospects for inclusive governance in Syria, in a post-Assad Syria, which just a few weeks ago perhaps felt like a distant hope. We are witnessing an extraordinary rate of change across the country, both militarily and politically, and discussions are emerging about the country's future governance arrangements. So what happens next? So this is a unique opportunity to engage with inclusive negotiations over those new governance arrangements, hoping for those that can protect community interests, listen to and take on citizen preferences and voices, and build a coalition that is reflective of the religious, ethnic, and gender diversity of the country, right? Thinking about how to write a new constitution for all Syrians. And indeed, some form of inclusive governance is likely to be necessary not only to maintain elements of stability, but also to prevent further mass displacement and to enable refugees to return home. As part of this, considerations of transitional justice loom large. The pictures from the prisons and mass graves are harrowing as families continue to search for their lost loved ones. We also know that the external environment will prove daunting. Israel has already begun bombing military targets in Syria, even before a transitional government had been appointed. The waning power of Russian, Iranian, and Hezbollah forces does not mean that they have gone away entirely. The role of the Americans remains unpredictable, as does the ability of the UN to play a significant role. So again, much uncertainty characterizes this transitional moment. Ultimately, the extent and nature of inclusive governance must be developed in a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned process. And this flash event seeks to reflect on this moment and to contribute to the evolving discussion about how inclusive governments might be built in Syria. And again, those opportunities and challenges facing it. So let me just say a little bit about the project and the format for today. So the Inclusive Peace, Citizen Inclusion, and Power Sharing Settlements project is funded by an Open Research Area 7 grant and brings together researchers from Canada, Japan, the United Kingdom, and New Caledonia. The team has been mulling over many of the questions on building, implementing, and sustaining inclusive governance arrangements with a focus on the critical moment of adoption, as well as moments of adaptation and reform across a variety of countries, including Bosnia-Herzegovina, Lebanon, Iraq, Cyprus, Northern Ireland, and New Caledonia. So we've been thinking about the kinds of processes that can support democracy and inclusion, that can bring citizen preferences to bear on the contours of an inclusive governance settlement, and the opportunities for direct citizen inclusion in the adoption of such settlements, whether through deliberative mechanisms such as citizens' assemblies or through referendums, all of which is meant to help support stable, fair, and inclusive government over the long term. Indeed, the very kinds of questions facing Syrians today. We're also happy to partner with the Forum of Federations for today's event. The Forum is an international organization based in Canada that develops and shares comparative expertise on the practices of federal and decentralized governance throughout a global network. So what we'll do is we will start with some short and focused interventions from our main speakers in the 5 to 7 minute range, who will discuss those opportunities and challenges facing the country. We'll then turn to our two discussants who will take a couple of minutes to reflect on the themes raised and how they might connect to wider frameworks around power sharing, decentralization, federalism, and inclusive governance. From there, we'll open up to a Q&A with the audience, so thank you all for attending. You will have the option to pose your questions in the group chat. There's a Q&A function that you can put there. You can put those questions as they occur to you, but we will pick them up after we've heard from all of our speakers. So please ensure that your microphones are off unless you are speaking, and we ask that you keep all contributions constructive and on topic. So let me now introduce our main panel of speakers. I'm delighted to be joined today by Sahar Ammar. So Sahar is a peace building and mediation practitioner specializing in the Middle East and North Africa region. She has facilitated and supported numerous multi-track negotiation processes, including high-level track 1 negotiations on power sharing and ceasefire agreements. Currently, she is a program officer at Swiss Peace, where she supports local peace building initiatives by providing capacity building for local actors and offering strategic and thematic advice. She has also collaborated with UN agencies to facilitate inclusive consultation and dialogue processes, including key local stakeholders in conflict-affected contexts. Sahar and I have also just finished work on a project on power sharing for peace, looking at the cases of Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. So delighted to be joined by Sahar. We will then hear from Fateh Saban, who is a Syrian academic specializing in human geography with a focus on the intersections of geopolitics, education, and societal resilience in conflict-affected regions. He currently serves as a researcher at the University of Kent and has previously taught at the Free Aleppo University and the University of Gaziantep. And his current work explores the dynamics of international aid, the socioeconomic impacts of the Syrian conflict, and the challenges of reconstructing higher education and infrastructure in post-conflict settings. Fateh also held several key positions with the Syrian opposition, including Deputy Minister of Education in the Syrian interim government and as a representative to the Syria Recovery Trust Fund. From there, we will hear from Noor Halabi, who is an assistant professor and interdisciplinary fellow at the University of Aberdeen, and her research examines the interactions between mobility, social movements, and media in the Middle East. She's the author of Radical Hospitality, American Policy, Media, and Immigration, and the co-editor of Middle Eastern Television Drama, Politics, Aesthetics, Practices. And then we will hear from Samer Shirani, who is a PhD candidate in political science at Sabancı University in Turkey. And his research focuses on peace theory, peace building, civil war, ontological security, and refugee mobility, including the role or dilemma of Syrian refugees and their relation to home. So as you can see, we have an extraordinarily wonderful panel of participants. So I will turn the floor over now to Sahar, who will start, and then we will hear from all 4 of our panelists before I will then introduce our discussants from there. So Sahar, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Alison, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. So my key or my introduction, my opening remarks will be related to some political and institutional aspects in light of the current developments in Syria. So now one of the main questions that are being asked are, what's next? What would be the format of the next governing body? What would be next? After the current government, would it be a transitional technocrat government? Would it be an inclusive government? So this is one of the main questions on the political level that is being asked today. And I think what's important is to focus on to emphasize the issue is that there is definitely a need for inclusivity, for representation. So what you mentioned, Alison, at the beginning, it's very crucial to have an inclusive, representative governing body that represents the different components of the Syrian social fabric, but also on the same hand, we should not fall into the trap of power division. We want to do a genuine power sharing. We don't fall into the mistake of power division, which has been committed in the neighboring country. If we take the case of Lebanon, for instance, there was a power division among political and military elite. There was which ended up or created a sectarian system. Similarly for Iraq after the fall of the Saddam regime. So we don't want to duplicate the same mistake in Syria. It's true that we want, that there is a need for an inclusive governing body, but it's also important to take into consideration the fact that the governing body also should be based on competence. It should be competence based. It should be also merit based. It shouldn't be just, the mere, it's not enough to allocate, for instance, a seat or a position to a specific group without taking into consideration the competences required for that certain position. Because in that case, similar to Lebanon, it will be power division, it will be sectarian governing body, and even on the social level, it will lead to further division and to paralyzed institutions. You mentioned, Alison, the project that we worked on power sharing. For instance, one of the research interviews for Iraq, for instance, he said that the power sharing arrangements in Iraq developed in institutions that were governed by individuals instead of creating institutions that are meant to govern the population and to deliver the expectations of the population. So it's very important that inclusion should be accompanied also by merit and competence. So this is power sharing on the governmental level. It's also important to look at power sharing from the territorial and the administrative aspect or lens. And here there are two main issues. The one issue is that there is so far no consensus on what would be the format of the state in the future, what would be the format of the local governance. Of course, over the years, since 2011 till now, there was many talks on, should we keep a centralized state with less prerogatives for the president, for instance, or should we go for decentralization? And even within the framework of decentralization, there are different views. Some actors, they are pro or they want an administrative decentralization. Others, they want political decentralization. We heard also about the new concept of broadened decentralization, which is mix and match between political decentralization and administrative decentralization. Some actors want also a federal local governance system. So there is no consensus yet. And I think what's needed is, to consult the population, to do a consultative process with the Syrian society to really know or to really probe their perspective on what kind of local governance system fits the expectations and could deliver the services for the population. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, also, during the years of conflict, we saw that there was an emergence of different forms of local governance according to the zones of control, because every de facto authority or every authority has its own institutions, has its own legal and institutional infrastructure. And these systems were implemented for years. So the question is how to come up with a local governance format that can reconcile these different local governance examples and models that were implemented on the ground, because sometimes even for one city, the city was split between two authorities. So again, I think the key is really to have this consultative process with the Syrian society, the different components of the Syrian society, to to like to probe their perspective and to consult them on what is the type of local governance or the types of local governance that should be implemented in the future in Syria. So this is with relation to power sharing, both governmental and territorial. On the social aspects as well, one of the main issues also is the trust building, how to restore the trust that was broken during these years of conflict, because the conflict has damaged the Syrian social fabric, has created divisions. So what are the trust building mechanisms that can be put in place to restore the trust? Again, we saw, for instance, in Lebanon that a power sharing agreement between political and military elite was not the key solution for implementing or achieving a genuine reconciliation. The different sects and the different religious groups until today, they are still they don't trust each other, and they are still attached to this ethnical sectarian identity. So for Syria, again, we don't want to duplicate, these examples or negative examples from the neighboring countries. We want to put in place a genuine trust building measures to restore the trust. And here, I mean, one of them could be we cannot keep a blind eye on the accountability and transitional justice. So it's important, to address the grievances. It's important to address the past. We cannot say we just turn the page and, keep a blind eye on the violations, political, economic, social violations that were committed over the past years. Transitional justice measures, again, with consultation with the Syrian society could be one of the trust building measures. It could be also through localized dialogues, local dialogues. It could be also through working with the Syrian civil society, because over these 13 years, the Syrian civil society has built extensive and important knowledge and skills. So it's now the moment to invest in the civil society that has emerged over the 13 years. So this is on the societal level of the trust building. It's also important to look at the other angle of the trust building between the society and the institutions. Because again, we are in a state where state institutions were perpetrators. So it's also important to build the trust between the society and the future state institutions. And this is again related to the merit and competence issues, because we don't want to create paralyzed institutions or sectarian institutions that would not deliver the services and the expectations of the population. Because we saw in the case of Iraq, for instance, when people do not trust the institution, they will create their own parallel systems. You will have parallel security systems, parallel economic systems. So it's important to also to build this trust between the state institutions and the society as well. And finally, I would say also there is a need for an inclusive national dialogue, for an inclusive consultative dialogue in the future, because the word should be for Syrians, for the constituencies of the society, for the Syrian civil society. So it's important, to put in place a consultative process that probes the perspectives of the different actors of the society in order to define the format of the next phase on the political level, territorial level, and the guiding principles also that would govern the next phase. So these are briefly the different remarks that I have.
It's great. Thank you so much, Sahar. That was really helpful to sort of set all of the major issues that need to be accounted for. So thank you very much. Okay, we will now turn things over to Fatah to share his remarks. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. Hi, everyone. First of all, unfortunately, the network where I am now is poor, so I hope it will not let me down. Anyway, in this talk, I will briefly address some of the challenges facing Syria nowadays. I will begin by talking about the complex issue of territorial control. I mean, the powers on the ground in Syria now. Throughout the conflict, Syria has been divided among various competing forces. And this situation, unfortunately, remains largely unchanged, even after the fall of the Assad regime. The northwest of Syria is being controlled by the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. Many of the Turkish-backed factions maintain control over parts of the northwest. In the south, there is local factions that are holding their ground. Although the fall of the Assad regime occurred without significant bloodshed, violations have been committed in some areas like Manbij and some neighborhoods of Damascus. Meanwhile, SDF is still occupying Arab areas in the northeast of the country. I think that the unification of Syria under a single authority, therefore, remains as unrealized goal. As for the power currently ruling Damascus, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, usually referred to as HTS, it seems to monopolize authority indeed in the country. And the previous government, presided over by Assad, has been replaced by the Salvation government, which already acts as the HTS executive arm in Idlib. I will now move on to talk about international sanctions and reconstruction. The international community has imposed numerous sanctions on Syria since the onset of the war in Syria, and this remain in place. And the global response to the Syrian situation is still cautious. Several governments have declared that it is too early to drop the sanctions. Key donors like mainly USA, EU countries, and the UK are refusing to finance any reconstruction process in the country, in Syria, until there is a political transition in Syria. And this stance hasn't changed yet. Adding to this challenge is the classification of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as a terrorist group, terrorist organization. And several countries have indicated their intention to reassess this classification depending on how HTS behaves in the coming period. The international community has set several demands for the current authority in Damascus, including forming an inclusive government, protecting minorities, and reducing Russian presence in Syria. On forming an inclusive government, no progress has been made yet, unfortunately, as I have just mentioned. However, on protecting minorities, progress has been made, especially in the city of Aleppo. And I believe that it has been likely due to the local awareness of this issue. Minorities have lived in Syria for centuries, and their presence in the country is not alien to the fabric of the Syrian community. While Russia has withdrawn many of its troops from Syria, it still maintains two military bases on the Syrian coast. Negotiations between the government in Damascus now and Russia regarding this presence are ongoing, but I believe that ending this presence will not be an easy task. Despite the withdrawal of Iran and Hezbollah from Syria, numerous foreign forces remain in Syria. In addition to the Russian bases, there are dozens of the Turkish military bases in the north of Syria. The United States and many other European countries also maintain several bases in the northeast and the northwest of the northeast and southeast of the country. Meanwhile, Israel, which has occupied the Golan Heights since 1967, has begun expanding its control into new Syrian territories. The withdrawal of these foreign forces from Syria will neither be easy nor come without significant concessions. The last point is related to the social reality. Syrian society has experienced fragmentation and depression over the years of war. We can see that a generation has grown up with diverse and different cultures. Reintegrating these new generations, the Syrian society will not be easy task either, especially for those Syrians living in exile. Will they return to their homeland? I believe most of them will not return anytime soon, as the situation in Syria remains unclear and unsafe, and they are not sure what they will find. Unfortunately, many of the IDPs, internally displaced people who have returned to their homes, have found them destroyed and uninhabitable. And this forced them to return to their tents in the northwest of Syria. I would like to conclude by saying that the prospects for inclusive governance in Syria depends on the ability of its leaders and people to navigate the challenges of transition with unity and foresight. By embracing diversity, fostering reconciliation and building democratic institutions, I think Syria can emerge from decades of tyranny as a model of resilience and inclusivity. While the road ahead is fraught with challenges, I believe that the determination of the Syrian people and the support of international community can make this vision a reality. Thank you very much for listening.
Right. Thank you so much, Feta. That was really, really informative, and appreciate the perspective.
I hope that the connection was good.
Yeah, you worked great. It was perfect this time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. With that, I'll turn things over to Noor for some comments. Thanks.
Thank you for this event. And I think given the expertise of this panel, this is a wonderful lineup with some really substantial credentials. I've decided to focus on the things that I could add that are complementary to the aspects of areas of interest that other people on the panel will focus on. So I'll start off with something really important that is, I believe, fundamental to understanding how Syria for Syrians can begin, which is the fact that in 2017, I wrote a paper talking about how the Syrian revolution is not a failed revolution, rather a revolution that is ongoing, and it requires us to rethink the time scale of when revolutions take place, when we determine whether they have failed or not, and who determines that outcome. And today I am reminded of the fact that the global sort of international academic community is sort of writing off and writing of the situation as a civil war, and neglect of the perspectives of Syrian academics who oftentimes wrote under the threat of a regime that will go after second, third, and fourth degree relatives. This is a moment for international academia, but also international organizations and the whole world to take a moment and take stock, and to not be neglecting the perspectives of Syrians. And perhaps this is one of the reasons a panel like this is so important and so necessary and so well managed. And I think it's important to point that out at the outset. Of course, the situation we have in Syria is one where a more civil opposition, an unarmed opposition, obviously given the conditions that the regime has enabled, was not the one who finally led us to a final conclusion of this problem. And as a result, we have an armed group, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who is now sort of at the helm of a transitional process when primarily they are a sort of military group. And there's a big question mark here around how they can manage this transitional period. A lot hinges on the rapid adaptation and opening up of the thinking of this group that is at the helm now of the transitional government. They are no longer governing Idlib province. They are now governing Damascus and Aleppo. These are places that are very different, very diverse, and urban cities that are hubs of human civilization for centuries, and have quite a lot of diversity, not only sort of sectarian ideas, but internally within different groups. There is a lot of intergroup diversity among Muslims, among Sunnis, among Shia. And so there's a lot of need as well to be sensitive to, for example, essentialist or absolutist definitions of what Muslim voters will want. They're going to be really needing to think more widely about how they govern Damascus and Aleppo and the rest of the country differently from how they governed Idlib. And here I will give an indicative snapshot of this issue, we recently had a very prominent strike of firefighters and civil defense workers in Damascus, responding to their sort of effective termination or attempted termination and replacement with the white helmets and with sort of employees from Idlib. And what we saw with this sort of pushback and the reversal of that decision is precisely the tension that this group is going to have to face, where they're going to very quickly realize that Damascus is not Idlib, the rest of the country is not Idlib, and they really have to sort of break open their thought and be adaptive and pragmatic. The second thing that is very pressing, and of course, I will not touch on the refugee issue because I know, Samir, you will be touching on it a lot more, and I know, Fatih, you brought that up as well, is an infrastructure concern. 80% of Syria lives under the poverty line. Vast parts of the country have been destroyed, including, for example, like you said, IDPs returning to homes that have been shelled. And so there is a rapid and almost immediate need to scale up the infrastructure and to respond to some immediate needs, perhaps with temporary housing. There needs to be some solution here, including people who in the intermediate period have lived in other people's homes and now need a place to go now that IDPs are returning to their homes and need to live in them. The other problem, of course, and that's looming on the horizon, is the question of refugees. Very quickly, we will start to see refugees coming in. If not, and I agree with Fatih, so many of them are holding their breaths and waiting, although again, I will leave this to you, Samir, to address a lot more. But even if not for moving in, but also for temporary visits, and this raises an urgent need to scale up the infrastructure to be able to absorb this amount of people that is coming in, even for temporary visits in a country where there's electricity issues and all sorts of public service issues. The third issue is the families of the disappeared and imprisoned. And perhaps this is the folder, this is the issue where we see the greatest weakness of this transitional government, and where this folder represents exactly where this transitional government is perhaps not equipped for what they are facing. What we saw with the shambolic handling of the liberation of political prisons, known for a very long time to be human slaughterhouses, given the delicacy of the matter at hand, represents one of the key indicators of the current leadership's short-sightedness with regards to the responsible handling of post-conflict transition. We saw the opening up of prisons that should have been handled very carefully, methodically, with an eagle-eyed sort of attention to the preservation of evidentiary documents and materials. And instead, we saw this shambolic opening up with lots of uninvolved people coming in as well, and the very clear destruction of evidentiary documents, as well as irresponsible airing of material. Instead, there should have been an opening that was very methodical, very careful, alongside several reputable media arms who have clear adherence to media ethics and the highest ethical norms, especially in terms of dealing with trauma and interviewing people post-traumatic events, as well as displaying sensitive and triggering images. We saw, again, with each of these issues, I will give an example, and here I will give the example of Clarissa Ward, who for a very long time, people in the Middle East have been clarifying the fact that Clarissa Ward does not have, and I say this as someone with a PhD in media and communication, does not have the requisite media ethics to be navigating the difficult environment of the Middle East. And she has displayed that repeatedly with other conflicts that she has been airing, including her coverage of Russia, as well as her coverage of Israel-Palestine and the current Gaza attack, and now Syria. We really needed to see some very responsible work, not only by media institutions on the ground, but global media institutions who really needed to respond to the fact that this is an environment where you've got a population that for a very long time has lost trust in not only in government institutions, as Sahad has pointed out, but trust in media. and the fact that there was a very, very immediate need to build media trust and to restore a sense of sort of professional norms and veracity to material being aired, especially in the context where there are a lot of regional players who are now involved in spreading misinformation in Syria. There should have been a forensic, an archival set of experts that accompanied the opening up of prisons and who were involved on hand to immediately begin preserving and digitizing materials. And this brings me to my last issue, and that is the role of women in this government. And Wafa Mustafa, who is very involved in the families of disappeared movement, who has a disappeared father who still doesn't know anything about his fate, has been very vocal about how the file of the families of disappeared relates to the issue of women. We have a situation where for 54 years we have been dealing with a highly militaristic, highly misogynistic, masculinist regime. And one of the key elements I see in terms of breaking down that toxic dynamic is through the involvement of women in key positions of power, the consultation of women throughout, including specifically on the issue of families here that should immediately have involved the consultation of families on how they would like the opening up of prisons to have taken place and how they would have liked the treatment of documents to take place. And this is consistent with other issues going on. The recent declarations by the official spokesperson of Ahmed Shara, of the political administration, suggesting that the role of women should be restricted to bizarre essentialist assumptions around women's capabilities and their biological limitations, restricted, for example, to raising children or the education sector, suggestions that women have a right to education and to learn and to teach. However, not to practice certain professions, especially here the focus was on women judges. But again, this is part and parcel of the problem that I see, which is without the involvement of women, we will never stop breaking down this militaristic and masculinist pattern that we saw. And I think with that, I will wrap up and hopefully hear from Samir, his sort of continuation of issues. And I look forward to hearing more from all of you during the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Noor. Again, some really, really insightful comments there about sort of particularly around questions of media and the role of women. So really appreciate your thoughts. Okay, Samir, whenever you're ready, I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Alison. Thank you so much, Noor. Unfortunately, I will not elaborate more on the refugees issue, but I will mention it a little bit for time things, you know. So now I start from the assumption that now in Syria we have already, or hopefully we'll have in the future, a victor's peace, right? And in terms of power, on power sharing, I approach power as politics of identities, i.e., how we define who we are, what Syria is, who a Syrian is, the politics of forming identities. This is how I approach power in this 5 minutes talk. Hence, from this point, power sharing, prospectively speaking, can be or should be established on the basis of contestation, on contest, not on the basis of even liberalism or tolerance, nor on the idea or the notion of accepting the other. Rather, we should base the goal of power sharing on the basis of contestation. By contestation here, I refer to simply competing over the formation of identity, national identities, group identities, collective identities, including ethnic or religious identities like Sunni, like Muslim, like Shia, etc. And even intersectional identities, right? So contestation in this way is essentially peaceful, otherwise it will be violent conflict, right? It When we frame it in such a way, then the other becomes a rival. You don't need really to accept the other fully, but the other will stop to be a threat, right? You need it to compete with in order to recognize yourself, to form yourself, and to create a mutual ground or even a contestable ground about of who you are and of who we are. And I think right now, and at this moment of the Syrian history, the contestation, we have a very good, suitable situation for contestation precisely because the Syrian identity is either empty or at least it is very weak. So now we can rush to fill it in with this contestation. And if we look right now, let me go a little bit from theory to and from the future to reality. Now the victor says two things. First, we will not impose something on something else on someone else, right? Second, we will tolerate, right? The victor says these two things, and this like taking into account the situation in Syria, the reality in Syria, this is really good and this is really admirable. However, these assertions first recognize the existence of minorities. Mhm. Second, they accentuate the new hegemon, right? The identity of the new hegemonic identity, the identity of the victor, right? And this is also normal and acceptable so far. Based on that, I think that by we, I mean liberal people, liberal scholar, secular scholar, need to work with, not against. We need to work with Tahrir Sham, the opposition, not to accept what they do, not to accept what they say, but we need to form Syria as if an exhibition in which multiple norms, multiple identities, multiple techniques of speech, technique of saying things could be also represented and could compete with each other. We need to accept, in other words, the multiple different groups of Syria, the different groups in Syria, including, even the previous regime. As far as no blood is shed anymore, right? Saying that, let me emphasize on an issue I think that is really essential, that there is no neutral position, right? So yesterday I saw a wall on us in my hometown, which is a minority, it's a stronghold of Ismaili minority in Syria. On that wall, it's a school wall. It was written Allahu Akbar. Mhm. So this wall, whether it's painted with phrases such as Allahu Akbar, or with phrases such as democracy is good, or left intact, even the wall left empty is not a neutral position. So there is no neutral position. That's why we should work with, not against the Syrian opposition, even if they are Islamist, whatever they are, right? Uh, yeah, and only then I think we can generate new alternatives that are based on differences, on generating, multiple other options just to be presented, right? Then, hopefully, one time in the future, someone to say, I don't want to impose X on Y will be nonsense, right? Because we already have multiple other options. Regarding refugees, I think that the point that refugees can really contribute or they can insert in the Syrian situation right now is exactly this contestation, because especially those who live in Europe and on Turkey, because every refugee is a site of contestation in terms of identity, in terms of ideologies, etc., etc., etc. Right? So in Germany, some refugees were, celebrating, chanting Allahu Akbar, right? Some people, some Syrian refugees, other Syrian refugees, got angry about this behavior, right? So this site, the bodies of refugees, a site of contestation, can also serve as input into this moment of formation of a new Syria. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Samir. I really appreciate your comments. So again, that was 4 excellent interventions and so much to think about there. So I would invite folks to put any questions they might have into the Q&A box. We'll pick them up in a few minutes, but now we'll hear some short interventions from our 2 discussants. So first we'll hear from Joanne McAvoy. Joanne is a professor of politics and head of social science at the University of Aberdeen. She's a co-investigator on the Aura 7 Inclusive Peace Project. In her research interests lie in post-conflict power sharing with expertise on Northern Ireland and Bosnia-Herzegovina. She's also conducted research on grassroots constitutional deliberation in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. After Joanne, we will hear from Rupak Chattopadhyay, who is the president and CEO of the Forum of Federations. That's a position he has held since 2011. And over the last 2 decades, he has contributed as an expert in support of political and constitutional reforms in a variety of places, including Ethiopia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Tunisia, and Yemen. So I'll turn it first to Joanne, and then from there to Rupak. Thanks. So Joanne, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much, Alison. Thank you so much to our main speakers, most importantly, for being here with us today at this moment for Syria, for sharing their expertise and their insights. And we've already learned a lot for our project and hopefully for everybody else in attendance. I feel privileged to be able to say a few words to contribute to the discussion. As Alison said, I'm one of the co-investigators on the Aura 7 project, Inclusive Peace, Citizen Inclusion in Power Sharing Settlements. Alison's already introduced the project. We're an international research project that does have some relevance to what's happening in Syria. It's a comparative multi-methods research program that investigates how post-conflict peace settlements, in particular power sharing settlements, how they emerge, how they perform, and how they evolve over time. We've got 7 cases, Northern Ireland, South Africa, Bosnia, Lebanon, Cyprus, New Caledonia, and Mindanao. So let me start by saying, and I think this is particularly relevant for the discussion, is that a key critique of peace settlements broadly and power sharing settlements in particular is that such settlements cannot be easily negotiated. They are adapted and often negotiated between elites in ways that exclude wider society. So an important critique is that such processes leading to power sharing or peace settlements more broadly close off or fail to create space for citizens' engagement and participation. And we've heard from our speakers generally, I think a key theme coming through is the importance of consultation, the importance of reaching out to different groups and divisions within groups and to appreciate and not to assume what those interests might be, but to create that space in what will likely be a very challenging process of transition. So let me first provide an overview of the key puzzles that we are working with in our comparative research that speak to the challenges that Syria certainly has been facing for some time, but will likely become even more pertinent as the country moves towards a transitional process. So the first challenge is the challenge of mediation, of international mediation. So a question for us to think about is, how does inclusive governance or power sharing get on the mediation agenda? By whom and why? And how might multiple mediation efforts lead to a settlement, particularly when there are divergent interests on the part of the external actors involved in those parallel or conflicting processes? How can inclusion be promoted and enhanced? And how can mediators deal with this divergence of preferences among multiple groups? So then, as I've already alluded to, there's a challenge of citizen participation and endorsement of a settlement or a process that might lead to a constitutional outcome. So what influences public support for a particular settlement and the shape of that settlement? Do citizens ultimately have a role in designing how a process might unfold over time? What explains the divergence of preferences across groups in the power sharing literature that's often called the asymmetry of preferences on the part of different groups, and what capacity do citizens have to shape it? There's also then relatedly a challenge of community mobilization. How do community leaders engage with citizens or the grassroots? How do they persuade people to engage with a peace settlement process? So we're clearly at a remarkable moment for Syria, even a crossroads in terms of what kind of process might evolve in the weeks and months and years even ahead. The situation in Syria clearly shows us the enormity of the challenge of transitioning to a more peaceful, better future for everyone, with so much injustice and trauma that needs to be addressed. And our speakers have already with great candor have approached some of those challenges. We know that a journey from conflict to peace, of course, is incredibly difficult. A central question for us is what are the conditions under which peace settlements are negotiated, accepted and implemented? And we all know that there's been much discussion about the applicability of power sharing in Syria, where the divergence of preferences among diverse political actors has meant that a settlement has remained far out of reach. The Syrian experience, of course, also highlights that challenges of complicated mediation with different externally led processes, the UN-led Geneva process and the Russian-led Astana process, different external states involved for different reasons and with shifting priorities and different interests. So I'll end by suggesting that the Syrian situation raises a series of important questions, most importantly, of course, for Syria itself in its efforts to hopefully move towards a smooth and effective transitional process, but also for the wider field and, of course, for our project. Questions concerning inclusion, which have been alluded to and spoken to on the part of our experts, about who gets to be involved in negotiation towards a settlement and a wider transitional process, who gets to decide who is involved and who is not, who is excluded, and on what basis, questions that are all the more challenging given the complexity and diversity of groups in Syria. There are also questions, of course, about what's happening on the ground in terms of security, in terms of military control of territory by different groups, and how this will impact the emergence of a process towards a settlement. There are clear questions too about elite or leader willingness and unwillingness to compromise and on what basis. And finally, and I'll just end with that key question that we are grappling with, is about the interaction between leaders and ordinary people, whether and how citizens have the opportunity to shape a process towards the design of a new constitution, new political institutions, how they might engage and how they might be able to express their approval or even their dissent. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joanne, for setting us some good questions to pick up on in the Q&A as well. Rupak, I'd like to hear from you next.
Thank you, Alison, for the invitation. This has really been very, very educational for me. I'm very grateful to the presenters for providing us some context as well as giving us an update on what's unfolding on the ground here. You know, clearly as an outsider, this is both fascinating, but of course being far removed from what is happening on the ground there. I can only offer some reflections based on my own experience over the last quarter century as somebody who's worked in in the area of democratic and constitutional transitions, particularly in post-conflict situations. Again, within the context of inclusion, Syria, to my mind, as somebody who's worked in federal and decentralized government, is that federalism or decentralization of some kind provides a useful framework for accommodating diversity in Syria, which everybody agrees is largely territorially concentrated. But even in the context of where it's not territorially concentrated, there may be institutions there that can be, that one can look at. Historically, and I didn't know this until I actually looked into Syria more recently, there is history of the Syrian Republic as a loose federation in the 1920s. So there may be lessons there that Syrians can go back and look at. We know the federation failed not so much because the Syrian people wanted it to go away, but because the power that had the mandate over Syria then felt that this was not necessary. So there may be lessons in one's own history, recent history, that one can look at. But of course, there are some very real challenges facing the new administration or government in Damascus. The first, of course, again, one that is not unprecedented elsewhere, is transitioning from being a militia to becoming a civilian administration or government. But this is a challenge that other movements have successfully navigated. To my mind, one of the biggest challenges facing any new government in Damascus is the reunification of a fragmented state. There is not only social fragmentation, there is territorial and political fragmentation, with large parts of the country having been ruled by different competing dispensation over the last decade and more. And I think this is where leadership is very important. The role of we focus on constitution, we focus on dialogue. We tend as constitution builders even to focus on institution building, but I think leadership is at the heart of it. And the rebuilding of a unified, inclusive, representative Syria is greatly dependent on on those who we as scholars and as small d Democrats tend to dismiss as elites. But it's very important. Leadership is very important because without some kind of agreement between the elites and the leadership, there's very unlikely to be forward movement on rebuilding a unified state. And a leadership discussion between the leadership need not happen in a vacuum. These can certainly happen in parallel with consultations and dialogues on rebuilding a state which meets the aspirations of all Syrians. I think it's also very important to note that again, based on my own experience in other parts of the world, that as one moves forward with dialogue, consultations on building an inclusive state, inclusive institutions, one thing that's ever present, and again, I guess every state that's been through this has to square the circle, is striking a balance between group rights and individual rights, and in what direction sort of one goes. An additional complicating factor in Syria's case is the stake that its neighbors have, either through direct occupation of Syrian territory or through their strategic interests in Syria. And so there has to be some way of engaging and negotiating this. Last but not the least, of course, given the multiplicity of militia, there is the issue of DDR, disarmament and reintegration. But I think that one at this stage one is far away from that. Let me conclude by saying that in building an inclusive state has two parts to it. One is ensuring through some kind of decentralization that people in various parts of the country feel secure and satiated through a process of self-rule, where they can manage their own domestic affairs. But I also think it's important not to lose sight of shared rule centrally or at the national level. And through this, to work out also in parallel issues of equitable mechanisms for the distribution of natural resources, whether that's oil, revenues, water, arable lands, because sometimes these can undo a process that may be going forward successfully. So let me stop talking here. Territorial integrity balanced with autonomy, decentralization, power sharing, resource allocation, minority rights, and of course, the aspiration for democratic governance. All of these have to be negotiated in the context of in a strategic context that is not necessarily conducive to the challenges that the Syrian people and the various factions in Syria will now have to navigate. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rupak. So we can now open up to the Q&A, and I see that some are beginning to come in, both in the Q&A and in the chat. Perhaps I will turn it over first to Fergal Cochrane, who is also a co-investigator on the Inclusive Peace Project, to start us off with the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Alison, and all fantastic contributions so far, I think, which demonstrate, I suppose, that we're at the beginning of a process here, and there's lots of issues. One, I just wanted to throw in, before coming to the questions, a couple of generic points that I think certainly link into the Northern Ireland experience, which is where my expertise lies. And one of those is that inclusivity was integral, really, to the legitimacy of the peace process and the institutions that have been built in Northern Ireland. But it didn't come easily. So there is a sort of a question here, which is who actually wants inclusive governance? You know, that's not as just a technical problem or a political or operational issue. You know, that's an existential question, or it's a philosophical question. And it isn't the first thing people are going to land on. I really want to include other groups that I don't have to. So there is an argument, I think, that before, you know, that actually is going to be a difficult one to win. Why would more powerful actors include less powerful actors? And in the Northern Ireland case, it was because when the less powerful actors weren't included, or the less maybe elite-based groups weren't included, there was not sufficient buy-in in the institutions, and they failed. So there is a self-interest maybe of more powerful actors to actually be more inclusive, but that's something that I don't have enough knowledge about, but I would be interested to hear about from our speakers. The second point I wanted to make was that there will be tension between the political elites and more inclusive aspects of society, and certainly in the Northern Ireland case, there was tension. And I think it'd be very odd if there wasn't tension, you know, amongst the various actors about the whole practice, and as Joanne was saying, you know, where are the limits of inclusivity? Who has a right to be included? What's the basis on which you would demonstrate that right? That, you know, that again is going to be a major issue, I think, and it's not just a Syrian problem. You know, that's generic across lots of different political contexts. And the third thing I just wanted to throw in generically is, no matter how much preparation is done, and no matter how inclusive you design a process, things have a way of turning out differently. And certainly the Northern Ireland case would demonstrate that that the process that they ended up with and where we are now, one of the big sort of pillars of the institutions that were to be inclusive was dumped several years afterwards, and that was the Civic Forum, and that was dumped pretty quickly, despite all the inclusivity that was part of the design. So there's another, as if there weren't enough problems and issues. You know, there's issues there to do with how do you actually try and ensure that what you think you are building is delivered several years afterwards. And that's maybe just one thought to leave you with. We've already got some really great questions. I'm going to be summarizing the questions because some of them are quite detailed, and I won't be using names. So anybody who is part of this, as it's being recorded, anybody who wants to put something in the chat or ask a question, please feel free. That we won't be using names as part of the recording. And there's sort of a quite a common theme here, which is the HTS in particular presents itself as, or has presented itself as being a voice of moderation publicly and in the media. So one of the questions is, you know, just their credentials in the past have been as an Islamic fundamentalist organization. So is there a chance that, you know, they will say one thing in public and do something else when, you know, when they get the capacity to do so over time? And the parallel was used over the Taliban in Afghanistan post 2021, when they said that women's rights would be protected, but that's clearly not happened. So that, I think, is a question for everybody, and I won't direct it at any one individual. So if anybody wants to pick that up, let's go with it.
Yeah, Samer, please get us started.
Yes, for sure, this is a huge concern for everyone: Syrians, minority, Christian, Alawite, Ismaili, Druze, etc. Right? In addition to the international community, and of course, no one can guarantee, right, that the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham will keep its current moderate rhetoric, right? However, two important points we can shed light on. First, they don't have the capacity to be that much repressive, especially after the last week Israeli strikes, which destroyed what remained from the Syrian army, right? So now Syria is without army. This one thing. Second, not one thing, like in the same point about capacity, they need the international money to reconstruct. Well, like Syria is not a country right now, you know. There is no country, there are no cities. The country is highly damaged, so they need the money of the international community. That's why I think they will be a little bit restricted or refrained from radicalizing or their rhetoric again. Three, Syrian community is different. Syrian communities are different from maybe other communities, including Iran, you know, after 1979, including Afghanistan. I don't think anyone can, and I say that in kind of half-joke way, I don't think anyone can stop a Damascene woman from entering a court. She simply will gather like maybe like 100 person around him if he tries to, you know, restrict her from entering a court. And and no one knows what I mean. So the Syrian community is hopefully different from others that will restrict any intention of any Syrian leadership to be radicalized again.
Right, thanks. And Noor, you want to jump in?
Sorry, I should have muted myself, Samir, but there was actually a woman political prisoner that responded to some of the, and it was very much along the lines of good luck with Syria. So I wanted to respond to something along the lines of what you said, Samir, but also where the lines are drawn. The Syrian public is a lot more sophisticated than people would assume, and I don't think we fall for media rhetoric as much as what is on the ground. And the Syrian public, and specifically Syrian women, are very attentive to the fact that we are not seeing women being either consulted or placed in positions of power in this new government. And so I don't think they're very focused on individual statements, although there's a lot of rhetoric about whether the statement is an individual opinion. I would say, given the fact that he's an official spokesperson, this is part of their talking points. And so we need to take them at their word and take it very seriously. So the facts on the ground are that they are not involving women. Now, similar to what Sam is saying, I think there is a lot of international pressure that can be leveraged here, especially since this is a group that is still not widely accepted by the international community, and because there are also a lot of there's an embargo on Syria in a moment where they definitely need the political economy to kind of revivify. So that will be an arm of pressure. And I agree. Now, I have spoken about this with Syrians. I actually think that there's no opposition generally among the Syrian public for a party that has some religious thought to lead in a certain. I argue that it's very similar to sort of the CDU post World War II Germany, wherein there was a moderate, but there is a Christian element to this party, and if they adapt something that is similar in character, I don't see why there would be overall strong opposition beyond, of course, pragmatically too. I think there's a factor of Islamophobia and fear of Islamism in general that will mean that international players will need assurances, whether or not that is in its place or not, and fair or not. So these are some of the things. And yes, I agree. Even if they're promising things and they don't follow through, good luck with Syrian women.
Thanks. Zahar.
Yes, so I just wanted to also reiterate what Noor and Samir has said. I mean, the picture is still unclear. So, and every transition comes with fear as well. So it's not clear, where things are going to. But I think also, I mean, in addition to what Noor said, I mean, also the Syrian civil society, I think it's a strong civil society. It has been very active over the past years. I think you're also like, relying on this strong civil society, relying on these capacities is also very important in this moment. And then also, I mean, as has been said, I mean, Damascus and other areas are different from the northwest. I mean, Syria has a diverse social fabric. Every city or every region has its own specificities. So I mean, even for HTS, it's not feasible basically to govern the whole of the country as if, like in the same way, following the same way they used to govern in the Northeast. I mean, in addition also to this international pressure, the fact that they need the international community, so they have to do some compromises. It's different, I would say, from the situation in Afghanistan, but it's, I think we will see what will happen with the time. Yeah.
Yeah, Noor.
Not to monopolize the time, but one other thing that's occurred to me too, and I've spoken to people about this, is that the women file seems to be for HTS testing the waters. So they're playing on the fact that it doesn't affect half the population, and that there is an ingrained sort of paternalistic sort of issue there, where a lot of people will accept this "we will tolerate" narrative. That is sort of a testing the waters to see what goes, but also overstepping on what a transitional government is entitled to saying, because the discussion around the role of women was also part and parcel of a discussion on the Constitution, which a transitional government should not be unilaterally deciding. So I think it's kind of these two issues are very tied in together with there's a question in the chat somewhere about creating facts on the ground and overstepping, and perhaps that aspect of this question.
Thanks. Maybe to another question. Fergal, I don't know if you want to pick up here, or if you would like me to.
Yeah, fine. Absolutely, Alison, no problem. And this actually, we're still on HTS, I think, and there's a question about the legitimacy of that organization, and this is for specifically for Samir, but others are allowed to intervene if they want. But in the sense of, are they in control because they have won their position through conquest rather than through the popular will? So are they a minority faction speaking for a bigger section of the population than they should be? Are there legitimacy questions around them, and what are the arguments surrounding that?
Yeah, certainly the question of legitimacy is really right now very problematic, because just the Assad regime fell down last week, 10 days ago. So, we don't know what is going on. And but in terms of legitimacy, through following social media, Syrian social media, even among minorities like Ismaili people, I sense that there is a kind of hope, quote unquote. But of course, hope is not enough to define legitimacy, right? And for sure, the opposition took over the country by military method, right? So they won the war. They are the victor right now. And so if we want to ask or question their legitimacy, maybe we should look at Idlib. So where they legitimize their Idlib, many people were protesting maybe every week against them, right? But is that enough to say they are illegitimate in Idlib? I don't know. This needs more investigation. And but what really concerns me is that how Syrians, since the independence from France, would form or would approach legitimacy. We have never, as Syrians, we have never touched any, free political era where we can really develop this concept or this experience of legitimacy or illegitimacy. So Assad regime was illegitimized for sure, but this delegitimization of Assad was expressed through a very bloody civil war that lasted for 13 years, right? So regarding legitimacy, I'm more concerned about in the future how Syrians can really establish this, regardless of who will be in office.
Yeah, Fatah. Yeah, please jump in.
In terms of legitimacy, I think this is a reality. Hayat Tahrir Sham doesn't have any legitimacy. Also, neither the current government in Syria doesn't have any legitimacy because it has been appointed by Ahmad Shara, Muhammad Julani, who is the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham without any legitimacy. And this doesn't align with the constitution anyway. But let us talk. After the fall of the Assad regime, there was a gap in the country. Who would lead the country? There should be someone to lead the country. Even as an interim government, even it was appointed by the victor. The victor, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, would the control over everything. Then they could appointed some people to run the country. And but the most important point here is the international position from this government and from Hayat Tahrir Sham. It has changed dramatically. It seems that all of them welcome the change in Syria. They have sent a lot of missions to Syria to discuss, to negotiate with the current government in Syria. So I think the legitimacy now is for power, not for the constitution or even for the people.
Okay, thanks. I don't see any other hands on that one, Alison.
Okay.
And maybe sort of moving the conversation slightly onto our sort of next big sort of question, which is this tension between the country and external actors, all of whom have various interests and are saying, well, we'll leave it up to Syria, but please don't do this or that, or else. So I'm paraphrasing slightly. And the question here is about Turkey and why Turkey is so focused on eliminating the YPG rather than taking a more pragmatic or balanced attitude toward that group. And there was a quote, if you want to look in the question, there's a quote from the Turkish foreign minister about saying the elimination of the YPG is our strategic goal. Either they dissolve themselves or they will be dissolved. Which sort of also connects in with Israel's recent activities as well, sort of almost, preemption. And so the question here is, can an inclusive peace truly be achieved by sidelining the YPG? And at a wider level, this is just me adding on a sort of coda, really. How can Syria possibly determine its own future when powerful external actors are pulling it apart?
Who'd like to go first on that question?
That's for everybody.
I think, yeah, Fatah and then Noor. Yeah. Oh, and then Samer. Yeah.
I added something in the chat box about my point of view. Anyway, Turkey consider not just country, the international community consider YPG as a terrorist group because of their relation to the PKK. PKK is classified as a terrorist group, either by the United States of America or by the European countries. But now, in this case, in the country, in the area, Turkey tried to eliminate all the armed Kurds group, and there in Syria, I think, I'm sure, the leaders of these groups are not from Syria. They came from outside Syria, and most of the Kurds. This is what I have learned from my Kurd friends. even this group is not good with the Kurds themselves. So Turkey now is trying to exploit the current situation in the area to eliminate PKK and YPG in Syria. Because if those groups become strong in Syria, they will be strong in Turkey, and they will dangerous the situation in Turkey. And and I think now, because um, this group is being protected mainly by the international coalition against ISIS. Now Trump is coming to the power in the USA, and Trump has said many times that Erdogan is my friend, and they have good relations. So this will be extremely against the Kurds. I mean the classified groups of the Kurds in Syria.
Thanks. And Samer.
Okay. Yes, like this is also, we know now, like we know, all of us know that the Syrian civil war is an internationalized civil war, or internationalized intra-conflict, right? Interstate conflict, right? So this is a fact we cannot ignore. This is a reality, and we should deal with this reality. So of course, maybe in the coming 10 years, we may not really have, a genuine inclusive peace. Many actors are already muddling into the Syrian situation. But again, from a realistic perspective, when I saw the chief of the Turkish intelligence in Damascus, I felt relieved, because I assume at least they know how to manage complex situation with long bureaucratic experience, right? So also, again, having the American troops in Syria, you should now keep them, because ISIS is still a dormant threat, right? We need those troops. Of course, we don't need Israeli troops inside Syria because they are useless. But other troops, I think so far, we cannot really. We need those people who also were engaged in our murder, in other words. We need those people who were part in the Syrian conflict, in other words. They cannot simply withdraw. You remember when the US withdrew from Iraq, right? What happened? ISIS took control of half of Iraq, right? So from my opinion, I think we should be a little bit pragmatic, realistic, having those states now engaged in the so-called peace process, peace building, whatever it's called, post-conflict situation, is a necessity.
Thank you. Noor, I think I saw your hand up at one point here as well. I'm not sure if you want to jump in on this question or if there's other ones from the chat. We've got a ton of questions in the chat happening here, and mindful of time as well.
So I wanted to quickly touch on this question, but also leave space for Fatih and Samir, because they addressed the core part of it regarding Turkey and all of the dynamics there. But I wanted to also talk about the role of Israel here. I actually think that Israel had a golden opportunity when it came to Syria with regards to having a nascent democratic state next door that had a particular stance towards Iran and its role in extending the bloodshed that took place. And I think there is a massive miscalculation with regards to how Israel has acted in the first few weeks of this new Syrian state. That cannot be redressed. We cannot go back in time and have Israel act differently as a neighbor. And I think the Israeli people really need to ask themselves whether peace through violence can be achieved, and whether they're being sold false hopes there, and whether there could have been a different path forward. Because I do think government walking around with an expansionist map that includes quite a lot of the region, and that predestines quite generations of Israelis to fighting and war for forever and ever to maintain and sustain this map, is something that the Israeli people immediately need to deal with. And perhaps they need to start acting less like a people who is governed by a non-democratic government and more like more like the Syrians who were very outspoken even under extreme oppression regarding the decisions of their government. So just a quick touch on that, even though it wasn't the central part of your question, Fergal, but relating to external actors.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Should we move on maybe from the political to the economic, which is probably a session in itself. But there's a question about, who are the main economic players now, both domestic and external, in terms of the reconstruction process, and how does that connect in with a lot of the perennial problems about, transition, reconstruction, and profiteering and post-conflict situations. That's another easy one for you all. Thanks.
Anyone want to jump in on the economic piece? Yeah, Samer, please.
Well, I don't know about a lot of these things, but we know, reconstructing a country in a post-conflict zone is a very critical situation because it could, and it might do so, it could foster inequality deeply in the structure of the society. And people who live there, let me just give an example about refugees vis-a-vis those who remained inside the country, right? So X person could be a refugee right now in Germany or in Sweden and maybe he or she already has become a citizen. Why? Because his counterpart is murdered, killed, tortured in Syria, right? This is by itself, the moment of establishing asylum is based on inequality between who could escape and who could not, right? So what if now we move from this point to the economic situation? So someone is earning 2,000, 3,000 maybe euros. Someone is earning 30 euros a month, monthly speaking, right? So now that rich person, the privileged side, could go back to Syria, and he or she or an institution or a company would create a situation of inequality, right? Because local people inside Syria cannot compete with them. For example, to rebuild an entire neighborhood, an entire district, right? So this is what also concerns me. Reconstructing a war-ravaged country, could really foster inequality in the structure of the society. So how that could be managed, I don't know. I don't think it has been ever managed in the world. So this is another situation we have to deal with in the future.
Thanks. Thank you. Samer on this question, or sorry, Fateh on this question.
Thank you, Alison. I think the reconstruction process will start soon in Syria if political transition happen in the government. This is the main, and if there is an inclusive government in Syria soon. This is what all European and USA, UK countries have talked about. We want to see an inclusive government in Syria. And also, I think that the European country and USA, mainly European country, will be the main funder for such a process because they would like to send the refugees back to Syria. How could they send them back without reconstruction in the country? And there is another question about the main player or something like this. Who would be the main beneficiary of this process? And I believe it will be Turkey. Because Turkey, they have a lot of economic problems, and reconstruction in Syria will be a good opportunity for their companies to be included in this process. Also, Turkey geographically and from the geopolitical perspective has a good power now in Syria. They have a long borders, about more than 800 kilometers with Syria. They have forces on the ground in Syria. They have good relation with the current power in Syria, with many factions, military faction in the northwest of Syria. They have a good relation now with the USA, as I have mentioned about Erdogan and Trump, and they have the ability to be included in the reconstruction process in Syria. So I think Turkey will be the biggest winner from the reconstruction process in Syria.
Great, thank you. Okay, so mindful of the time and the fact that there are many excellent questions still left in the chat, what I might do is invite our main speakers for any final brief comments of reflection or summary, either drawing from what you see in the chat or anything else you would like to add, and then I will turn it over to Neo for our final word from there. So if anyone has any final points they'd like to add, now's your chance to do so. Yeah, Sahar.
Yes, maybe just a quick final remark. I think, I mean, we mentioned, I mean, colleagues mentioned that, you know, like Syria, I mean, before and now is highly internalized and internationalized, and many, you know, external actors are trying to, you know, like stay or remain involved in the Syrian context. But I think, nevertheless, I mean, it's also, it's important and crucial to emphasize that, you know, the upcoming processes should be Syrian-led processes, you know, there should be definitely consultations first with the Syrian actors, with the local actors, with the, you know, like the different constituencies. And this is like the key, you know, towards a sustainable stabilization and a positive peace. You know, if we impose a solution coming from abroad, I mean, we saw in the neighboring countries, you know, like to which extent the involvement of international actors have led, you know, to a negative peace and even to destabilization. So for the case of Syria, I think it's very important to give the voice first to the Syrians and to consult with the local population, with the civil society, that it's really, you know, has a strong capacities over and has built like amazing competences and capacities and knowledge over the past years. So that's all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sahar. Noor, Bata, or Samer, Noor?
So a quick note that I've added my email in the chat because I think there were some excellent questions, but we will not be able to cover all of them. And I think it's very important, like Sahad said, I have witnessed years now of Syrian voices being marginalized in discussions, whether it be on refugee issues or other things. So I think it's important to be reaching out to Syrians and hearing from them and reaching out to we have a moment in time where there is a deep level of expertise. Every panel I get invited to with other Syrians, I am in awe and humbled by my country folk and who I sit with. So I invite you to maybe share emails and reach out to people afterwards with further questions.
Wonderful. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Noor.
For me, the same also, the same applies to me. I would like to be engaged in further dialogue and discussion about the future of Syria and how we can really form or contribute to forming a more sustainable peace, more inclusive peace in the future. So far, we should not be really hopeless. We should a little bit, embrace some kind of hope, and we'll see how things will unfold.
A little bit of hope is a good thing, absolutely. Bata.
Final words. We as Syrians, we all understand that it is not an easy period for all of us, either in Syria or outside Syria. It is, and it will be very difficult and maybe a grueling process in Syria in the coming days. But I think my colleagues agree with me. But I believe that the first step for a better future for Syrians, for a better lives for Syrians, for the return of the refugees, for the freedom of the country has been achieved, which is the fall down of the Assad regime. This is my belief. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And again, thank you to all of our speakers for just wonderful insights and for sharing your time with us. I will now hand things over to Neil Wazides, who is a principal investigator on the Inclusive Peace Project and a professor of international conflict analysis at University of Warwick, for our closing word.
Thank you very much, Alison, and everyone for your exceptional interventions. One of the first things that I would like to mention is the need for a Friends of Syria global movement. There have been exceptional contributions from the Syrian civil society that have not received the attention of the international community. Syria deserves a better future for itself, a Syrian-led peace process that will bring the country to a change. We have seen precedents of that in other conflicts around the world. A Syrian peace movement, Friends of Syria, internationally supported, is something that is absolutely needed in these transitions. They happen very infrequently, every 50, 60 years in countries like Syria. This is a unique period for Syrian academics, for Syrian civil society, for politicians in Syria who well-intended and might be in a position to bring change. They deserve the absolute support of the global public opinion. We have seen this happening in Ukraine with a lot of support for Ukraine. We haven't seen it in Syria. So events like these, making a small contribution to this movement, to the capacity to help support Syria. A couple of other thoughts as to the way forward. As I mentioned before, changes like this happen every half a century, and it's important that in the Middle East region we don't think in terms of preemption. That was a word that Fergal used, but in terms of cooperation. Everybody has a past. The current Syrian leadership has a past. The Kurds have a past. Obviously, the former dominant regime has a past. But that's the essence of inclusive democratic governance. Sometimes. Even in situations where there have been conflicts and hostile encounters in the past, you give the opportunity to sit together and resolve your differences in a negotiating table rather than in a conflictual environment. There are three streams of thought in our projects that could be particularly useful. As Ruba has mentioned, the Forum of Federations are working a lot on decentralization, and often working with the local authorities, municipalities even, can allow for practical solutions to emerge. This is one of the major highlights, if you wish, of our research and the research of the Forum of Federations. A lot of research in our group has focused on inclusive governance. It has been mentioned a lot in the international media on how inclusive governance is necessary for Syria, but I haven't seen much about how the exact content of that will benefit the Syrians. So this is a conversation that we can have with Syrian experts, especially given a long encounter with different models around the world. What can work for you, and what kind of incentives need to be in place in order for the more powerful groups to consider listening to these kinds of recommendations. If we have 30 seconds with a leader of Syria, with Syrian leaders right now, what would be their punchlines as academics, and we make a difference in this type of discussions. And finally, a lot of expertise in our group in public opinion polling. If anybody needs to have a conversation with us about public opinions in divided society, some of the leading experts are in this chat and can help with the way forward in research projects or public engagement projects as well. Thank you very much again. That was an incredible event. Thank you very much, everybody. Alison, Fergal, Joanne, for your incredible contributions in organizing this event.
Wonderful. Thank you. And again, thank you to the audience for excellent questions and for joining us for this conversation today. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Alison.
Thanks, Sahar. And Neo, can you grab the recording?
I need to leave, I think, and then it will appear. It has to have a few seconds to set up.
Okay, sounds good. And then we'll
Excellent.
reconnect. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, it looks like it stopped now. Oh, no. It went well.
Yeah, I'm stopping the recording.
Thank you.